It was a bright, sunny Saturday morning in Pinewood Hills. This was a little neighborhood where things were usually quiet and calm. The houses sat in neat rows, with green lawns and pretty flowers. Everyone seemed to know everyone, or at least, that's what they thought. Kids rode bikes down the street, dogs barked at squirrels, and the sun shined high in the sky. It felt like a perfect day. But something was brewing. Something big. Let me tell you about Jake Miller. Jake was a guy who lived in a small house on Pinewood Lane. He wasn't super tall or super short. He wasn't loud or wild. He was just Jake. He had a big, friendly smile that made people feel good. His house wasn't fancy, it was plain and simple, with a little porch and a red door. Jake liked it that way. He didn't need a lot of stuff to be happy. Every weekend, he'd pull out his lawnmower and cut the grass. Bzzz, bzzz, bzzz. The sound would hum through the air, and he'd wave at the mailman as he passed by. "Hey, Tom." Jake would call out. "Nice day, huh?" The mailman would wave back and keep going. Jake didn't bother anyone. He wasn't the kind of guy who threw loud parties or left trash on his lawn. He kept to himself most of the time. If you saw him, you might think, "Oh, that's just Jake. He's nice, but nothing special." And that's how Jake liked it. He didn't need everyone looking at him. He didn't need big attention. He was happy just being himself, living his quiet little life. But someone didn't like Jake. Someone was watching him, and not in a friendly way. Her name was Karen Swanson. Oh boy, Karen was something else. She lived 3 houses down from Jake, in a big white house with perfect bushes and a shiny mailbox. Karen wasn't just any neighbor, she was the HOA queen. HOA stands for Homeowners Association. It's a group that makes rules for the neighborhood, like no pink flamingos in your yard or keep your grass short. Karen loved those rules. She loved them too much. She thought it was her job to make sure everyone followed them, every single day. Karen was the kind of person who always had her nose in other people's business. She'd stand by her window, peeking out from behind her curtains, watching everything. If a kid left a toy on the sidewalk, boom, Karen saw it. If someone parked their car a little crooked, yep, Karen noticed that too. She carried a clipboard with her everywhere, writing down things she didn't like. Her pen would scratch across the paper, scribble scribble, as she muttered to herself. "Not good," she'd say. "This won't do." People in Pinewood Hills knew her. They'd see her coming and whisper, "Oh no, here comes Karen again." On that sunny Saturday, Karen had her eyes locked on Jake's house. She wasn't looking at his red door or his neat lawn. Nope. She was staring at his driveway. It was just a normal driveway, gray and flat, where Jake parked his truck. But there was something there that made Karen's eyes narrow. Something tiny. Something most people wouldn't even care about. A crack. One little crack in the concrete, no bigger than a pencil. It was just a small split, like a thin line running across the ground. If you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it. But Karen? She saw it. And to her, it wasn't just a crack, it was a disaster. Karen stood there, hands on her hips, staring at that crack like it was the worst thing in the world. "A crack," she said to herself, her voice sharp. "In my neighborhood. Oh no, this is bad. This is very, very bad." To Karen, that little split wasn't just a mark on Jake's driveway. It was like a giant sign that said, "Jake doesn't care." She thought it made the whole street look messy. She thought it made her look bad, because she was supposed to keep everything perfect. In her mind, that crack was practically a crime scene waiting to happen. She could already imagine it growing bigger, swallowing up cars, ruining houses. Okay, maybe not that crazy, but to Karen, it was a big deal. Jake didn't know it yet, but trouble was coming his way. He was inside his house, sipping a glass of water, enjoying the sunny day. He had no idea Karen was outside, glaring at his driveway like it had insulted her. He didn't know she was about to make his day a whole lot weirder. But Karen wasn't going to let this go. Not a chance. She was already planning her next move, her fingers itching to grab her phone. She wanted to do something big. Something loud. Something that would make Jake wish he'd fixed that crack sooner. "Hey, you watching from somewhere sunny or rainy today? I asked you earlier. Drop it in the comments below, I'm curious." And here's a fun question, would you call the cops over a tiny driveway crack? Tell me what you think, and stick around, because you won't believe what Karen did next. See, this story's just getting started. Jake's a regular guy, minding his own business, but Karen? She's about to shake things up. What's she going to do? How's Jake going to handle it? You'll find out soon, so don't go anywhere. The sun was still shining bright over Pinewood Hills. The birds were chirping, and a soft breeze rustled the trees. Everything seemed peaceful until Karen Swanson decided to march across the street. She didn't just walk, oh no. She strutted, like she was the boss of the whole neighborhood. Her shoes clicked on the pavement, click, 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 and her head was held high. She looked like she owned every house, every lawn, every blade of grass. And right now, she was headed straight for Jake Miller's yard. Karen stopped right in front of Jake's driveway. Her lips were pressed together tight, like she'd just eaten a sour lemon. In one hand, she held her trusty clipboard, the one she always carried to write down every little thing she didn't like. In her other hand, her phone was ready, her thumb hovering over the buttons like a hawk waiting to swoop. She stared down at that tiny crack in Jake's driveway, the little split in the concrete that most people wouldn't even notice. But to Karen, it wasn't tiny. It was huge. It was awful. It was a problem she couldn't ignore. Jake Miller, she barked, her voice loud and sharp. She pointed at the crack with her pen, jabbing the air like it was some kind of monster hiding in the ground. This is unacceptable, she said. Do you even know what this does to property values? This crack makes the whole street look bad. I'm reporting you to the HOA right now. Her eyes were wide, and her face was turning a little red. She was mad, really mad. To her, that crack wasn't just a mark. It was like Jake had broken some big, important rule, and she wasn't going to let it slide. Jake was standing on his porch, holding a glass of water. He'd been watching the clouds roll by, just enjoying the sunny day. But when he heard Karen's voice, he turned his head. He saw her pointing and yelling, and he scratched his head with his free hand. Karen, he said, his voice calm and slow, it's just a crack. No big deal. I'll fix it next week, okay? He didn't sound worried. He didn't sound mad. He just sounded like Jake, easygoing and relaxed, the way he always was. Next week. Karen screeched. Her voice went so high it sounded like a whistle. Next week. No, 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 Jake. This is an emergency. This can't wait. I'm calling 911 right now. She waved her phone in the air, holding it up like it was a magic wand. She acted like that little crack was about to open up and swallow the whole neighborhood, houses, trees, everything. Her finger tapped the screen, and she started pacing back and forth in front of Jake's house, muttering to herself. This is ridiculous, she said. This is dangerous. Someone has to do something. Jake watched her from the porch. He didn't move. He didn't yell back. He didn't even frown. Instead, he just shrugged his shoulders, like none of this was a big problem. He took a sip of his water and leaned against the railing, his eyes following Karen as she stomped around. And then here's the weird part, he smiled. Just a little smirk, tugging at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a big grin or a laugh. It was small, quiet, like he knew something Karen didn't. Like he had a secret tucked away, waiting for the right moment. And trust me, he did. Karen was making a big fuss, but she had no idea what was coming her way. Karen didn't notice Jake's smirk. She was too busy being loud. She spun around and pointed at the crack again. Look at this, she shouted, even though Jake was right there looking at it. This is a disgrace. You should be ashamed, Jake Miller. I've lived here for 10 years, and I've never seen anything so terrible. She flipped open her clipboard and started writing, her pen scratching fast across the paper. Scribble, scribble, scribble. Crack in driveway, she mumbled as she wrote. Owner refuses to fix. Emergency situation. She nodded to herself, like she was solving some giant mystery. Jake tilted his head. Karen, he said, still super calm, it's not that bad. It's just a little line. I've got some stuff to fill it with. I'll take care of it soon. His voice was soft, like he was talking to a kid who was upset over nothing. But that only made Karen madder. She stopped writing and glared at him, her eyes like little fireballs. Soon, she snapped. That's not good enough. This is my neighborhood, and I won't let you ruin it. She shook her phone at him again, like it was a weapon. The police need to know about this. They'll make you fix it. Jake didn't say anything back. He just stood there, sipping his water, that tiny smirk still on his face. He wasn't scared of Karen. He wasn't annoyed. He was just watching. Like he knew this whole thing was going to turn out funny. Karen kept pacing, her shoes clicking louder now, her voice getting higher and higher. I can't believe this, she said. You think you can just ignore me? You think this doesn't matter? Well, you're wrong, Jake. You're so wrong. The tension was building. You could feel it in the air, like a storm about to break. Karen was loud and bossy, throwing her words around like they were rocks. Jake was quiet and still, letting her talk without fighting back. But that smirk, it was a clue. It told you something was up. Jake wasn't worried, even with Karen yelling and waving her phone. Why? What did he know? What was he hiding? Karen thought she was in charge, but she didn't see the bigger picture. She didn't know Jake had something up his sleeve, something that was going to make her wish she'd stayed home that day. Karen wasn't done, not even close. After yelling at Jake on his porch, she didn't just go home and forget about it. Oh no. She stayed right there in front of his house, acting like she was on a big mission. For the next hour, she paced back and forth on the sidewalk, her shoes going click, click, click against the ground. She didn't stop moving. She was like a bee buzzing around, too busy to sit still. And the whole time, her eyes were locked on that tiny crack in Jake's driveway. That little split in the concrete. It was all she could think about. Karen pulled out her phone and started snapping pictures. She didn't just take one or two. Nope. She took pictures from every single angle. She bent down low, holding her phone close to the ground, snap. She stepped back and aimed from far away, snap. She even climbed up on her tiptoes to get a shot from above, snap, snap, snap. Evidence, she said to herself, nodding like she was a detective in a movie. I need proof of this mess. She flipped through the pictures on her phone, smiling a little, like she'd just caught Jake doing something really bad. But Karen didn't stop with pictures. She decided she needed more people on her side. So, she marched over to the neighbors' houses, her clipboard tucked under her arm. She knocked on old Mr. Thompson's door first. Mr. Thompson was a nice guy with gray hair who liked sitting on his porch with a cup of tea. Knock, knock, knock. Karen's fist banged on his door, loud and fast. When he opened it, she didn't even say hello. Mr. Thompson, she whined, pointing across the street at Jake's house. Look at Jake's mess. That crack in his driveway, it's ruining everything. Don't you think that's awful? Mr. Thompson peeked out, squinting at the driveway. He saw the crack, but it didn't look like a big deal to him. He scratched his head and said, Karen, it's just a little line. Jake's a good kid. He'll fix it. But Karen didn't like that answer. She huffed, her face getting all scrunched up. A little line, she said. This is serious. You don't get it? Mr. Thompson didn't want to argue. He just rolled his eyes and shut the door, nice and slow, leaving Karen standing there with her mouth open. She didn't give up, though. She went to the next house, Mrs. Lopez's place. Knock, knock. Mrs. Lopez opened the door, holding a broom. What now, Karen? She asked, sounding tired. Karen started whining again. Jake's driveway is a disaster. That crack is going to ruin our neighborhood. We have to do something. Mrs. Lopez looked over at Jake's house, then back at Karen. She sighed. It's not that bad, she said. Leave Jake alone. Then she shut her door too, click. Karen stomped her foot. Nobody cares, she grumbled. But I'll make them care. While Karen was busy running around and complaining, Jake was doing something else. He wasn't out on his porch anymore. Nope. He'd gone inside his garage, shutting the big door behind him. The garage was his special spot, a little room attached to his house where he kept his truck and some tools. But today, he wasn't just hanging out. He was working on something. Something big. Something loud. Every few minutes, a strange sound came from inside. Rumble, rumble, rumble. It was low and deep, like a growl from a sleepy bear. If you stood close, you could feel it in your chest, like the ground was shaking just a tiny bit. Karen didn't hear it. She was too busy yapping and taking her pictures. He's ruining everything, she huffed to herself, waving her clipboard in the air. She'd gone back to Mr. Thompson's house again, knocking one more time. "Mr. Thompson, you have to listen," she said through the door. "I'll make sure Jake pays for this. He can't just leave that crack there." Mr. Thompson didn't open the door this time. He just called out, "Go home, Karen." She crossed her arms and stomped back to Jake's yard, muttering under her breath. But Jake? He was still in that garage, calm as could be. He didn't care about Karen's whining. He didn't care about her pictures or her clipboard. He was too busy with whatever he was doing. That rumble, rumble sound came again, louder this time. A few neighbors peeked out their windows, wondering what it was. Was it a machine? A car? Something else? Nobody knew except Jake. He had his head down, tinkering with tools, turning things with a wrench, making that noise happen. And every now and then, he'd stop and peek out the little window in his garage door. When he looked out, he saw Karen pacing and yelling. And you know what? He smirked again. That same little smile he had before, like he was in on a joke nobody else got. He wasn't worried about Karen. Not one bit. Why? Well, Jake had a secret, a little something he was keeping to himself. It wasn't just tools or a truck in that garage. It was something bigger, something that was going to make Karen's whole day flip upside down. She thought she was the smart one, running around like a detective. But Jake? He was waiting, quiet and patient, letting her make all the noise. The air was getting thicker now. You could feel something building, like when you're waiting for a surprise and you don't know when it's coming. Karen kept talking and complaining, thinking she was in charge. But Jake's smirk said something different. He knew what was up. He knew what was about to happen. And Karen? She didn't have a clue. Not yet. The sun was still high in the sky over Pinewood Hills, but things were about to get crazy. Karen Swanson had been pacing and whining all morning about that tiny crack in Jake's driveway. She'd taken her pictures, knocked on doors, and yelled at anyone who'd listen. But now she was ready to take it to the next level. She grabbed her phone, her fingers moving fast, and she dialed 911. Yep, the real police. She held the phone to her ear, standing right there in front of Jake's house, looking like she'd just won a big prize. "Yes, hello, officer," Karen said, her voice loud and sharp. "There's a dangerous situation at 42 Pinewood Lane. A driveway crack, yes, a crack. It's a hazard, and the owner won't fix it." She was practically shouting now, her words spilling out so fast you could barely keep up. She waved her free hand in the air, pointing at the crack like it was a giant hole about to swallow everything. "He says he'll fix it next week, but that's not good enough. This is an emergency. You need to come right now." She nodded to herself, like she was the smartest person in the world, waiting for the police to say they were on their way. And then whoop, whoop, a sound cut through the air. Sirens. Loud and clear, coming closer and closer. Karen's eyes lit up like Christmas lights. She spun around, her clipboard still in her hand, and clapped once. Finally, she cheered. "Justice. The police are here to fix this mess." She stood tall, her chin up, watching the street like a queen waiting for her knights. She could hear the sirens getting louder, whoop, 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 and she just knew she'd won. Jake was going to be in big trouble now. She'd show him. She'd show everyone. But then wait a second, something weird happened. A police car turned the corner, its red and blue lights flashing. Karen smiled even bigger, bouncing on her toes. The car rolled down the street, slow and steady, and then, it didn't stop in front of her. It didn't pull up to the curb where she was standing. Nope. It turned right into Jake's driveway, tires crunching on the gravel, and stopped right there in front of his garage. Karen blinked. Her smile froze. "Huh," she said out loud, her voice small and confused. Jake stepped out of his garage just then. The big door was open now, and he walked out into the sunlight, looking totally chill. He had a rag in his hands, and he was wiping them off, like he'd been working on something messy. His big, friendly smile was still on his face, and he didn't look scared or surprised at all. The police car door opened, and a cop climbed out. He was tall, with a blue uniform and a shiny badge. He tipped his hat to Jake, like they were old pals, and said, "Hey, Miller. Got that patrol car engine fixed yet? Chief's been asking about it all week." Karen's jaw dropped. Her mouth fell open so wide you could have tossed a ball in there. She stood there, frozen, her phone still in her hand, staring at Jake and the cop. Jake grinned a big, happy grin this time, not just that little smirk he'd had before. "Yep," he said, tossing the rag over his shoulder. "Just finished it up. Wanna take it for a spin?" The cop laughed and nodded. "You bet," he said. "Let's see what you've got." And that's when it hit. The big reveal. The truth came crashing down like a bucket of cold water on Karen's head. Jake wasn't just some random guy with a cracked driveway. He wasn't just a quiet neighbor who mowed his lawn and waved at the mailman. No way. Jake was the neighborhood's secret weapon, a mechanic who fixed police cars for the local station. That rumbling sound from his garage? It wasn't just some noisy tool. It was him working on a real patrol car, making sure the cops could do their job. He wasn't in trouble. The police weren't here to yell at him. They were here for him because he was helping them. Karen's face went white, then red, then white again. She looked like she didn't know whether to scream or run away. What?" she stammered, her voice all shaky. "The police? For you." She pointed at Jake, her finger trembling. She couldn't believe it. She'd called 911 to get Jake in trouble, but the cops were already coming to his house not to arrest him, but to pick up their car. It was the wildest twist she never saw coming. Jake just shrugged, still smiling. "Yeah, Karen," he said, calm as ever. "I fixed their stuff. That's all." He walked over to the garage and pulled the door open wider. Inside, there it was, a shiny police car, all fixed up and ready to go. The engine purred when he turned it on, vroom, vroom, smooth and strong. The cop clapped Jake on the back. "Good work, man," he said. "Chief's gonna love this." Then he climbed into the car Jake had just fixed, ready to drive it back to the station. Karen dropped her clipboard. It hit the ground with a little thud, and she didn't even pick it up. She'd spent all morning yelling and taking pictures, thinking she was the hero of Pinewood Hills. But now, she looked silly. Really silly. Jake wasn't the bad guy. He was the guy keeping the police cars running. The sirens she'd heard weren't coming to punish him, they were coming to thank him. And she'd called them over a tiny crack. The air was buzzing now, full of surprise and excitement. Neighbors started peeking out their windows again, whispering to each other. "Did you see that?" they said. "Jake fixes police cars." Karen stood there, all alone, her big plan falling apart. Jake didn't say anything mean. He didn't laugh at her. He just nodded at the cop and watched him drive off, the sirens quiet now. But that grin on his face? It said everything. He'd won, and he didn't even have to try. Karen stood there in Jake's yard, her eyes wide and her mouth hanging open. Her face turned red, redder than a big, ripe tomato you'd see at the grocery store. She couldn't believe what she'd just heard. What?" she stammered, her voice all wobbly like she was about to cry. "You're with the police." She pointed at Jake, her hand shaking a little, still holding her phone from when she'd called 911. Jake didn't freak out or get mad. Nope. He just leaned against the police car he'd fixed, looking cool as ever. His arms were crossed, and that big, friendly smile was still on his face. "Not exactly," he said, his voice nice and calm. "I'm not a cop. I just keep their wheels spinning. I fix their cars so they can drive around and help people." He shrugged like it was no big thing. Then he looked right at Karen and added, "Oh, and Karen? That crack you're freaking out about? I'm patching it tomorrow. It's not a big deal. Relax." Karen blinked. Her face got even redder, if that was possible. She didn't know what to say. She'd been yelling all morning about that tiny crack in Jake's driveway, acting like it was the end of the world. And now, she found out Jake wasn't just some lazy guy, he was the one fixing police cars. She'd called the cops on him, but they were his buddies. The cop who'd come to pick up the car laughed a little. "Lady," he said to Karen, shaking his head, "you really called 911 over a driveway? That's wild. Maybe take it easy next time, huh?" He turned to Jake and held up his fist. Jake bumped it with his own fist, like they were best pals. Then the cop hopped into the police car Jake had fixed. The engine started with a loud vroom, and he drove off down the street, waving out the window. The red and blue lights flashed one last time as he turned the corner and disappeared. Karen was left standing there all alone. Her clipboard was still in her hand, but it didn't feel so important anymore. She looked around, and that's when she noticed the neighbors. People were peeking out their windows, pulling back curtains, and watching her. Some of them were whispering to each other. Some were giggling, trying to hide their laughs behind their hands. "Did you see that?" one neighbor said. "Karen called the cops on Jake, and he's their mechanic." They couldn't believe it either. Karen's shoulders slumped. She looked like she'd just lost a big game. She muttered something under her breath, nobody could hear what, and then she turned around. Slowly, she slunk back to her house, her shoes dragging on the ground. Scuff, scuff, scuff. She didn't look so bossy now. She didn't look like the HOA queen anymore. She just looked silly. Jake. He didn't chase after her or say anything mean. He just waved at the neighbors, his hand high in the air. "Hey, everyone," he called, still smiling. Then he turned and walked back to his garage, whistling a happy little tune. Whistle, whistle, whistle. He didn't need to brag or rub it in. He knew he'd come out on top, and that was enough. The crack in the driveway wasn't the only thing that got fixed that day. Karen's ego, the big, puffed-up part of her that thought she was always right, took a huge hit. She'd made a giant fuss over nothing, and now everyone knew it. Jake kept being Jake, cool and quiet, while Karen learned a lesson the hard way. And Pinewood Hills? It went back to being peaceful, at least for a little while. And that, my friends, is how a quiet guy like Jake turned the tables on a nosy HOA Karen. Can you believe it? 1 minute, Karen was stomping around, yelling about a tiny crack in Jake's driveway like it was the biggest problem ever. She thought she was the boss, calling the police and waving her clipboard like a superhero. And Jake? He just stood there, calm and cool, not saying much. But then bam, the truth came out. Jake wasn't just some regular guy. He was the one fixing police cars, helping the cops keep the town safe. Karen looked so silly, and Jake didn't even have to try hard to win. It was awesome. Sometimes, life is funny like that. The people you think are nobodies, the quiet ones who don't brag or make a fuss, they're the ones with the real power. Jake didn't need to shout or show off. He just did his job, fixing things in his garage, and that was enough. Karen thought he was nothing special because he didn't act big and loud like her. But she was wrong. So wrong. The quiet guy had a secret that made him way cooler than she ever guessed. And the ones who scream the loudest, like Karen? They might just end up looking silly when the truth comes out. It's like a surprise party you didn't see coming, everything flips, and the quiet kid gets the cake. Think about it. Have you ever met someone who seemed super boring or not important at first? Maybe they didn't talk a lot or act fancy. But then you found out they could do something amazing like draw the best pictures, or run super fast, or even fix cars like Jake. It's like finding a hidden treasure chest in your backyard. You didn't expect it, but there it is, full of gold. That's what happened with Jake. Karen thought she knew everything about him, but she didn't. She judged him too fast, and boy, did she get a big surprise. And Karen? She's not all bad. She just got too worked up over a little thing. She wanted everything perfect, her street, her rules, her way. But sometimes, trying to boss everyone around makes you miss what's really going on. She didn't see Jake's power because she was too busy yelling. If she'd stopped and looked closer, maybe she'd have figured it out. But nope. She kept going, and now she's the one who looks funny. It's a good lesson, don't be too quick to think you're better than someone else. You never know what they're hiding up their sleeve. So, what do you think about all this? I bet you've got some stories of your own. Have you ever surprised someone who underestimated you? Maybe someone thought you couldn't do something like score a goal in soccer, or finish a hard puzzle, or make a cool craft. But then you did it, and their eyes got big, and they said, "Wow, I didn't know you could do that." It feels good, right? Like you're the hero in your own story, just like Jake. Drop a comment down below and tell me about it. I'd love to hear what you've done. Did you shock your friends? Your teacher? Maybe even your annoying neighbor? Spill the beans, I'm all ears. This whole adventure with Jake and Karen shows us something big. You don't have to be loud to be strong. You don't have to tell everyone how great you are. Sometimes, just being yourself, doing what you're good at, even if it's quiet, makes you the toughest person around. Jake didn't fight Karen with words or get mad. He just kept being Jake, and that was enough to win the day. It's like being a superhero with no cape. You don't need flashy stuff to be awesome. You just need to keep going, keep trying, and let your actions talk for you. And hey, if you liked this story, give it a big thumbs up. It's fun to cheer for the quiet guy who comes out on top, right? Stories like this remind us that anyone can be a star, even the person you least expect. If you want more tales like this full of twists and surprises, hit that subscribe button. I've got lots more to share, and I'd love for you to stick around. We can laugh at nosy Karens and cheer for cool Jakes together. Before I go, let's think about one more thing. Next time you see someone quiet, someone who doesn't make a big fuss, don't count them out. They might be hiding something amazing, just waiting for the right moment to shine. And if you feel like the quiet one sometimes, don't worry. You've got power too. Maybe it's not loud, but it's there, ready to surprise the world. Like Jake, you can turn the tables and show everyone what you're made of. So keep being you, because that's the best trick of all. See ya next time, friends. Wave bye-bye to Karen and her clipboard, and give a big high five to Jake. He earned it.